Welcome back to the Outcomes Rocket podcast. I'm really excited to be doing another episode with Lumanity. And today we're going to be talking about launch excellence and how to build a scalable launch engine. You joined us for the first episode with Andrew and Lawrence, where we focused on smaller companies doing their first launch, maybe not with the background that many more experienced companies might have. Today, we're going to be talking about launch processes and guardrails that you need and how to keep them flexible as mid to larger companies in order to create that competitive edge as pipelines grow and launch volumes increase. Joining me today are Kirsty Tait and Jeff Hart. They are launch experts and also ex-pharma launch leads who now support with pharma and biotech organizations to build that capability and successfully navigate those ups and downs of launch. Welcome to the podcast, Kirsty and Jeff. Thanks for joining.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Working in launch is both highly rewarding, but also increasingly challenging. And I'm sure the majority listener will understand and appreciate from firsthand experience that the last few years we've been really having to do more with less. Navigate more and different diverse group of stakeholders, manage increasing access barriers, increasing competition, all with a backdrop of sort of tighter budgets and less or even shared resource. And that strong start is still so critical. The trajectory you take off with is really the trajectory you stay with for the majority. It's such an important topic. I think before we sort of jump into talking about what we need to do to scale the launch framework, perhaps if I could just set the scene with a real life kind of client example and situation that I'm sure will strike a chord. So it was a top 10 global pharma, absolutely not lacking launch experience. I think like many, had been used to launching multiple assets over a period of time, but the new challenge was about multiple assets concurrently and consecutively. So they were struggling with how do we scale this across the organisation. They had a framework, but quite frankly, they were struggling with it. It wasn't scalable because it had been built across a backdrop of sort of one type of launch, one launch asset and archetype, and really wasn't fit for that diversity of pipeline that they had. And one of the really big ticket issues that the leadership team were really concerned about was it either wasn't being used or it was being used so prescriptively that people were more focused on sort of ticking off activity checklists and weren't thinking. It had really impacted sort of the behavioural piece of it and ultimately outcomes. They've seen that real shift in sort of capabilities where teams were thinking not how do we win, but very internally focused on how do we fill in.
Yeah, so if I just carry that on for our job in that instance then was to kind of just help simplify, enhance, the planning process and ensuring that, that there was rigor, but with sufficient flexibility that, that the plan can be adapted by the business dependent upon the priority of the launch or the market archetype. So, we provide practical, pragmatic and user-friendly framework that can then, provide a number of different things. Firstly, their organizational consistency and quality, allowing the teams to kind of have those launch routines where, that were proactive and not reactive. The teams weren't starting from scratch, because obviously it's not efficient if they kind of re-engineer every single time. And they're giving confidence and the comfort to the leadership that the right questions, the right decisions, and the leadership scrutiny were happening at the right time. So then that also then gives, clarity on the not just the who, what, and how, but also ensures that the critical thinking and that challenge across, appropriate challenge across the business is just working, for the entire team, and it's not just a matter of ticking off the list.
Yeah. These are, phenomenal points here, Kirsty and Jeff, and it's complex. And we're in a world where, as you guys mentioned, pharma leaders are now having to deal with multiple assets at one time. The pipeline is deep, it's diverse. So that's the theme today. And so how can organizations build a scalable launch engine that drives consistency without turning people into box tickers, as you've called them, and really ensures that deliverable result time after time? So without turning people into box tickers and really ensuring they deliver results, that's the goal. So Kirsty, when launch volume and frequency increases, What tends to happen if organizations don't have that scalable launch framework underneath it?
So we often see three common pain points that show up rather quickly. The first is reinvention and inconsistency, which quite frankly burns capacity and also results in variable quality. So if every brand and asset team is inventing their own process, trackers, and definitions, roles, responsibilities, it's just an inefficient use of time. Teams are busy establishing internal process rather than focusing on the work that matters, that driving that impact and external focus. You also have the risk of, if it's not done very well and it's based on the individual quality rather than the organizational standards, that you're going to have duplication of effort, unclear accountabilities, people are misaligned, there'll be friction in that process. And then if you layer that up and you move someone from one launch to another, which is commonplace if you then have a series of ongoing launches that you move your launch talent around and learn from that, you're also going to have that confusion and chaos when one process is very different, one part of the organisation to another. So it's just another layer of hurt and pain. The second big ticket that we see and common issue is that slow or late decisions impacting sort of your workload and ultimately launch timelines. So if there isn't a clear governance process and approach to sort of sign off resourcing decisions, investment decisions, go, no go, you end up with being more of a reactive organisation, or teams really having to sprint at those kind of big ticket milestones, which is when you actually want to make sure things are as easy moving for them as possible, not put that extra layer of pressure and workload. And then the final thing we really see is that global to local disconnect and friction. So when there's that lack of clear roles, responsibilities from global, regional, local team, and also, collaboration principles, what you get as a consequence is global teams feeling really frustrated that local teams aren't following and executing global strategy, and local teams feeling really frustrated and constrained because they feel that global have given them a strategy or deliverables that really aren't fit for their purpose, and therefore they start rebuilding them. Either way, you get a waste of resources, you lose speed, and ultimately you lose that strategic coherence and strength in execution.
Now, there's some really great points, Kirsty, there. And, you have this tension of needing to remove friction by creating scalability, repeatability, consistency. And so I'm sure our listeners and viewers are thinking, yeah, that's great. But what about all of the differences across markets and assets? So if repeatability is the goal, how do you build a launch framework that scales but still allows for tailoring by asset and market? Jeff?
Yeah, so an effective framework shouldn't just add a little of bureaucracy. It should aid that repeatability that we're talking about. Bringing that right, allowing the right quality of planning so that the teams can spend their time on what differentiates and wins. So an effective framework that scales sets a number of things. So it sets launch standards and expectations for the team. So there's real clarity there. Creates a standardized launch planning and execution process, taking into account the respective priorities or archetypes, as we mentioned earlier on. And this in itself gives, helps enable a planning rhythm and the launch routines and forums and decision points so that, again, the teams aren't starting from scratch. They've got this framework in place, which they can adapt locally. So it then removes that reinvention. It reduces any of the chaos that could otherwise go with, a free for all, that rework and the decision confusion, so that teams can focus their own energy on what they really need to do to win. And when it goes wrong, backfires when it becomes a reg checklist and, there's a one size fits all or a focus on a compliance to a template rather than strategic thinking, if people just feel they just have to follow that set approach. So the goal is that flexible framework that enables intentional tailoring, so each launch team can focus on what they'll drive the greatest impact to their asset and the market.
Yeah, there's some good kind of processes there, and the way you laid it out, Jeff. So what do you standardize and what do you tailor? Just kind of like, how do people piece this together?
Yeah. So it really standardize the operating system. So that's not being invented by every team. So, what is the launch process? What are the decision rights, roles, responsibilities? What do we need to have ready for key decision gates? How should launch teams be activated effectively? What is our strategic planning process and guidance to sort of iterate and execute that launch plan? How should global to local teams effectively work together? What should be escalated and when and how? So it's the process and operating system, but as Jeff just alluded to and mentioned, it shouldn't be one size fits all and rigid for all launches. No two launches are the same. You can't have something for every permutation, but what you can have is some real clarity on dependent on how important an asset is to the organisation. So based on an asset's priority to the business, if it's a growth driver versus, a licence extension and established market, you would have different resource and focus on it. And then again, based on launch archetype, if it's something in a new treatment paradigm and a new TA and area for the business is very different again as to licence extension and in established therapy areas. So you can have some real concrete sort of areas that differentiate without it being too different. But those would be the key parameters that would determine your leadership attention and scrutiny and cadence of forums, reviews, investment and resourcing. So a really good starting point and foundation for yourself. And of course, fundamental is you tailor the strategy and the tactics dependent on what's needed to launch for that asset and for the market. You would even adapt global strategy based on your market reality and market archetype. And if you have a framework that does that, you can then ensure you don't over-engineer smaller launches, but you also don't under-support the bigger ones. So you put the focus and resource where it needs to be.
That's great, Kirsty. You guys make this sound easy.
Oh, if only.
And in the end, you really, the permutations of different launch types, you've got a couple, right? And so it's like you could still create that operating system that you're referring to while keeping that variability per kind of importance. So I really love the way you structured it, Kirsty. And so then that covers what you customize, how you prioritize. What about that global to local? Talk to us, Jeff, about how you stay aligned without slowing things down, because that's the big thing here.
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing is you've got to have a collaboration model that's, really clear, it's explicit, on a number of different factors. So the governance part around clarifying decisions, rights and accountabilities need to be set out. So who owns the core strategy and narrative and what local adaptation is allowable within certain guardrails, based on the market realities or, what should be escalated for agreement, by exception to the region or global teams. You also need to ensure that co-creation is intentional. So we can't really, co-create on everything. So it's prioritize the high impact work, the big ticket deliverables, with the priority markets, and this may include campaign or global value dossier, etc. If you try to do everything with everyone, it's just going to slow things down and create drag. So you also then need to ensure there's a centralized handoff for localization, and those things that fit for purpose and really importantly, on time. So where things are delivered centrally, they must be fit and on time. Local teams otherwise would just sort of start to build themselves, which can dilute the strategy, having inconsistent approaches. And it's, of course, costing time and money coming back to that, that wasted effort there. And then, the success, what success looks like. It's, local adaptation and refinement based on the market archetype, but not an entire rework. So you've got your consistency there. Also, should be said that it goes beyond materials. It's not just materials that, are co-created. There's, we should be looking for effective launch management ownership of external stakeholder relationships. There's, really important in many of the launches that I've worked on as well. Who engages with whom, with what objective and when. And there's clarity in those, the coordinated approach for that, those discussions, which prevent friction, which would otherwise, be brought up due to mixed messages, duplicated outreach, and it just ensures that the stakeholders' insights, that are received from those, can flow both ways into the strategy and the plans, to help feed, better planning moving forward. And I guess, in that as well, it's just absolutely clear then around over or underutilization of those stakeholders. If you're dealing with a healthcare professional, who owns that relationship, who's informed of those discussions, and what are the takeaways from those. So if successful, the signals that you see are, coherent engagement with stakeholders, teams feel informed and enabled, not constrained or restrained. And because global and local engagements often are, proactively communicated and coordinated internally, that then just, adds value to why we do what we do.
Yeah, appreciate that, Jeff. That's a good roadmap. So clear rules of the road, targeted co-creation, usable handoffs, who's talking to who owns what, and explicit stakeholder ownership. I mean, that doesn't get any clearer than that, Jeff. Really, really appreciate that. If you had to pick the top 3 enablers that turn launch activity into scalable launch engines, what are they?
Yeah, we've mentioned this already a couple of times, but I think number one has to be that organizational launch governance and operating process. So you've got a purposeful process that's effective. It drives the right decisions and actions with the right people at the right time. And it isn't just a reporting system. We can see many organizations have a process, but it is the tick box in its own right, and it becomes just reporting and educating on different markets and what's happening. What you want is something that aligns leaders and teams on what investment and resources, gets that released in good time, or if you're having the critical conversations, go, no go, what's needed to make sure that we optimize impact. I think secondly then would be about, if you're scaling, you need one centralized shared view of the truth. You can manage you're a one asset organization with different platforms to project manage. I mean, ideally you always have one integrated plan. But if you are running multiple launch plans, multiple launches rather, you don't want multiple trackers, platforms. It creates confusion. You don't get a simple view of what's happening, when and where. You don't have that coordinated execution. So having one central platform and way of working really does result in faster alignment, coordination, better decision making, and you can forget time about internal time, again, reconciling plans, providing updates. You can focus your time where it matters, which is fixing issues and keeping execution on track. And then I think thirdly, we've talked a lot about process, but a strong winning culture is fundamental to success. We talked very much a process, but behavioural excellence is what matters. So cross-functional team and leadership behaviours take you from good to great. And I think we've all heard Peter Drucker's sort of old adage that culture eats strategy for breakfast. That's absolutely true. You will fail if you don't have the right company culture. It's culture that converts that strategy and plan into effective execution. So, winning culture, absolutely fundamental to success. Winning performance teams, they raise issues early. They aren't scared to put something on the table and say it's not all green, green, green. They'll raise their hand for support so that you can make those decisions and trade-offs you need quickly. You also have that adapt and learn mindset. You need to be able to pivot and move as new information comes to hand, which it does, as launches straddle often quite a few periods and years, so things will change. And it's not just the team that I'm talking about here, it is the leadership piece as well, because often you can have a really effective team, but leadership really play a key role in sort of rallying the organisation behind a launch. If it's fundamental to growth, we want that clear vision, ambition and leadership driving that focus, driving that action and accountability and follow through and sense of urgency that you would want to see for it. Challenging the silo working, making sure people are working cross-functionally together, prioritising the key things that matter and not keeping themselves just busy, and really unblocking anything that the teams need help with, keeping that momentum up, making those timely decisions, reallocating support, solving issues for the team so that they can deliver as they need to and as they're expected to.
Those are great enablers, Kirsty. Thank you so much. I mean, I would hit rewind on this one, folks. It was a good one. And one thing that I've been enjoying out of these conversations with the team at Lumanity is how practical the advice we've gotten from them is. And so, Kirsty, Jeff, as we start to wrap up today's episode, I'd love if you could just leave us with some of those practical things, quick questions. We go there, perhaps, that our listeners can ask themselves to pressure test their launch engine.
Okay, so if you wanted to pressure test, are we in a good place to scale? Does our framework work? Does it scale? There are, I guess, 4 things you could ask yourself based on what we've just discussed. First is, does your governance and launch process ensure the right investment, resource and infrastructure is released at the right time? And is that process tailored based on launch importance and archetype, or is it a one-size-fits-all? Secondly, as Jeff really spoke to, are global to local roles and decision rights clear? Is there an effective two-way collaboration and co-creation model in place? Or is that, again, invented by teams and left to chance? Thirdly, it's one of those enablers I just touched on. Do you have a centralized global to local view of your launches? So can you see and your team see your plans, your progress and performance so that you can aid that decision making? And is that in a central place for all of your assets, or is it disparate per launch? And then I think finally, do you operate with a winning mindset? Do you have a winning mindset and culture? So have you got the expected behaviours and standards defined? Are they being role modelled? Are they being reinforced? Are they being rewarded and celebrated? Or again, is it words and actions don't also then add up and deliver those?
Thank you so much for those, Kirsty. Along with everything we're going to do in this podcast, we'll leave the show notes for you. Those questions in particular are strong questions that we want to make sure you're answering them. And if there are gaps, and maybe you might be hitting pause on this episode right now and thinking to yourself, wow, I actually have some gaps here. And if people want a clearer benchmark of kind of where they're strong and where they're exposed, what could they do, Jeff, to kind of fill those gaps?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that. We actually have just launched a free Launch Excellence Health Check. So in those show notes, perhaps we can put the link there.
Absolutely.
Really straightforward. Make sure the listeners can get to this quite easily. So it's basically a 15 to 20 minute online survey that benchmarks yourself against 5 fundamentals for launch excellence, and that pinpoints where there could be gaps in your that could limit your launch performance. And folks, if they want to complete that, that's fine. They get the report, but if they want, they can have a follow-up 30-minute call with us to walk through those results and then identify the top 2 or 3 improvements that could have the biggest impact on the outcomes. So really straightforward, Launch Excellence Health Check in the show notes, and really quick and easy to do the first step. And if they like, we're more than happy to follow up.
Thank you so much for that, Jeff. I mean, that's an awesome resource. We don't want to leave this to chance, and you never know where you're going to find that one idea that takes your launch to the next level. So this is the chance to do that, as Jeff alluded in the show notes. Final reflections, Kirsty and Jeff, take us home with today's launch discussion.
Yeah, I think really if your framework today, it sort of only works in one set of conditions, or it's so prescriptive that, smart teams stop thinking or stop using it, you've got a problem, and your framework won't scale and it won't help you win. For success, your framework needs to be pragmatic, simple, and effectively repeatable. It needs to enable that kind of launch process and standard to be plugged and played, but also flexed based on that launch archetype. And that's the only way that you'll ensure you'll get that consistency, efficiency, and quality at scale. And that helps you build your launch capabilities, but also gives confidence that with every launch, you're going to get stronger and stronger and really win. Ultimately, every pharmaceutical out there is about gaining competitive advantage and getting their products into the hands of patients that need and deserve them. So that would be my final words and recommendation. And Jeff, any final reflections from yourself?
Yeah, well, you said it perfectly, Kirsty, really. So the only thing that remains saying is just have the framework, build the muscle memory within the organization, with the flexibility that goes with that, all around collaboration, working appropriately with teams at regional, global, regional and local level.
That's brilliant. Well, I want to thank you both so much Folks, thanks for joining us. Just another incredible episode around launch excellence. In the show notes, as we shared, you'll find all the ways to get in touch with the Lumanity team, as well as get your health check for your launch. And again, just want to give a big thanks to Kirsty Tait and Jeff Hart, launch experts at Lumanity, for joining us. Kirsty, Jeff, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
No problem. You're welcome. Thank you.